2024 conference of the Mid-American Alliance of African Studies. And to end the conference, we're going to have a session in honor of a longtime MAAS colleague, Byron Santangelo, who passed away on March 10th, 2024. Byron came to KU in the late 1990s. Garth, who is our discussant on the panel, can say exactly when, but he came in the late 1990s and was at KU until 2021 when he left to take a position at the University of Indiana. Soon thereafter, he received the diagnosis of cancer, and he fought that long past the time that they gave him for a couple years, and succumbed to the illness in March, as I've noted here. So we want to take some time today to remember him in a way I think is fitting for someone like Byron, who cared a lot about ideas in the academic profession and sharing those ideas with people and making sure that certain ideas developed and continued. And for that reason, we're going to have a symposium where some students will comment on the intellectual legacy of Byron as it flows through their work or any other reflections they care to share. So we have an interesting collection of folks, and the people that I've invited to join us today are students who participated in a graduate seminar that Byron and I co-taught 4 times during our time together at the University of Kansas. The first time beginning in fall 2013, and the last time in fall 2020. So I don't have anyone from the first seminar here. That the person I contacted wasn't able to join us, but we have representatives of each of the other 3 iterations of the course, and that's about all I'm going to say for the moment, but I'll turn it over to them. We'll have 6 presentations, and when they're finished, we will hear from Professor Garth Myers at Trinity College. So the first presentation is by Ousmane Diop, who is a student at KU in the Department of French and Francophone Studies, and Italian, but Francophone Studies looms large for our discussion today. So Ousmane, please. So Chibuzor will switch out. Ousmane is gonna share his screen from here.
Thank you, Professor Adamus. Yes, is it on?
There you go. Okay, should be ready now.
Thank you. My talk today is less about a presentation, I would say, or paper. I want it really just to share what I call small anecdotes here and there, and also to show really how Professor Santangelo impacted my research and also my dissertations. My name is Ousmane Diop. I'm from the University of Kansas, and the title of my talk will be Professor Santangelo, a pioneer of past, present, and future. And I emphasize the future, and I will explain why, in fact, about the future. I'm a PhD candidate in French and Francophone studies. I was trained in Arabic, I was trained in Wolof also, and French at the same time. And my director of thesis is Professor Van Kelly. Yep. So, next.
Yeah, okay, no.
The talk has directly to do with my dissertation, and my dissertation title is Multidimensional Cultural Navigations and Translations, the question of languages between Senegalite, which is a set of Senegalese roots and values, if I may say, and cosmopolitanism in contemporary Senegal. Prof. Adams talked about the decolonizing knowledge class. I was part of the cohort in 2020, fall 2020. And the reason I was part of the cohort is thanks to my director of thesis, Professor Van Kelly, and I'm quoting him here on that. He wanted for me to attend this class and just to have much benefit about the class. And I quote here Professor Kelly. Professor Santangelo would be an excellent Africanist voice on your examination and dissertations committees. And the course itself is going to give you a founding and critical theory well beyond that you got in African studies. 802. And Professor Adams is also an excellent Africanist, and he's based on the Department of Psychology on that, and has full experience in East Africa and West Africa. So Professor Kelly advised me just to go to this class, and I went to the class, and the part I love the more, and I still remember vividly, is our discussions, because we had to have presentations by pair, with a binom, and then to be open up to questions with the class, and that's my favorite part of the class. And here, and I remember after one of my presentations, I had a questions from the panel, and I answer, and my answer was just the question is related to my concept of cultural navigation and negotiations. And I said, sometimes it is important to go back to our roots to better apprehend the present and envision the future. And I remember Professor Santangelo just telling me, hey, Usman, why are you talking about the future on that? Could you please develop? Could you just explain to them just why are you talking about the future on that? And the explanation, I remember just what I said was, in fact, in my dissertations, the easiest way to explain it is talk about cultural mobility and temporality on that. And I said that personally, myself, I grew up in Senegal. I went to the French school system. I went to France for my grad studies. I came to the United States after. Then I have hyphen. And these are part of who I am. I connect to people. That makes my identities on that. But also as a member of the diaspora, sometimes I feel lost with the globalizations. So what I do, I just backpedal. I go back to my country, I resource myself, and I come back. It's almost like I backpedal to better jump to the future on that. And that was my answer, in fact, to the audience. And that was really just how to say eye-opening for me and for the audience at the same, because sometimes we think that we go back to our roots, to the past, but in fact we do it in order just to better apprehend the future on that. And after that, Professor Santangelo said, okay, that yes, audience. Okay. And question mark. Okay. Correct on that. And these, when I talk about me in post-presentation, it's me talking, in fact, because I think just in my past, Professor Santangelo was also part of my comprehensive exam committee on that. And as part of my comprehensive exam committee, I remember that day he came just during my comprehensive exam. He had some type of, what do I say, just a little bit disagreement here and there with the other member of the committee on that. And the disagreement was more about my concept of cosmopolitanism on that. And he advised me just to to dig more about this concept of cosmopolitanism and ask these questions on that. I said, what does the standard concept of cosmopolitanism entails in terms of the nation, people, knowledge, and culture on that? And when I said that, I'm reflecting about my presentation. I did that presentation again, and then I sent an email to Professor Boss, Adams, and Santangelo, asking, oh, in fact, in reflecting on that, I realized that I need to dig more about this question on that. And I said, I said, it is an important question for me to address, particularly for an audience that is not familiar with this topic. Who is my audience on it, right? And I think I should have addressed this briefly well in my final paper. And in fact, Professor Santangelo suggested me to explore this question in my post-comment after my comprehensive exam on that. He anticipated even my comprehensive exam back to 2020 already. And he advised me just to better polish my definition of cosmopolitanism and push me toward cosmopolitanism with S. Not just, there is not just one cosmopolitan, but many, depending what lens are we just talking about on that. And this is a book by Robbins and Horta on that. And I mentioned that he kindly disagreed with the other member of my committee. The disagreement came from this. I think in my comprehensive exam, I said that, oh, in fact, young Senegalese, all they are trying to do is to express themselves, their voice. They just want to exist. It is not too much to ask. They are tired to be a ping pong, like a tennis ball, for political leaders, just for political purpose on that. And I quote Professor Sanders, he just quote, Usman, disagreement with the committee. I'm sorry, what you just said is about the edifications, the buildup of the national culture and national consciousness on that. I suggest you read the chapter on the national culture of Frantz Fanon, The Watcher of the Earth in 1961. And I did go back and I inserted in my research on that. This all make me say that I'm still hearing voices. It's almost like an echo. It's almost like I have hallucinations. It's here. I can hear him from where he is to tell me, hey, Usman, on that, just he's challenging me. Just why, Usman, why is the futurity so important in temporality on that? To this day, that's what I kept in mind from Professor Santangelo. I can still hear the echo of his voice telling me just go ahead, dig more and challenge yourself. That made me say in my mind, I have no doubt he's my pioneer of past, present, and importantly also of future. Rest in peace, Professor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Usman. Our next speaker will be Chris Hall from the University of the Ozarks. Yeah, sure. Do you mind if we put the first image I had up? Okay.
So what I have for you today is really just kind of a meditation on the prompt that
You might need to have the mic. You can take this mic thing.
This is just really a meditation on the prompt that Glenn set out when he invited me and my fellow panelists to speak here today. So I hope you'll excuse the sort of fragmentary and kind of abstract notion of what I've got here. I've titled this "In the Shades of an Influence to Byron Santangelo." I am first of all honored to be here, honored and saddened. Of course, Glenn invited us with the invitation that we come to speak on the development of our own work since the, in my case, spring 2017 seminar on decolonizing knowledge that, of course, Glenn and Byron co-taught and which I and my fellow panelists were enrolled in as graduate students. This was a very, gracious invitation. And really my only desire here today is to try to match its graciousness in attempting to do justice, to serve as a kind of opening to a path of doing justice, just a beginning to the teaching and scholarship and influence of Byron Santangelo. Besides teaching the Decolonizing Knowledge seminar, Byron was also in another graciousness that I could never repay, a member of my comprehensive exam committee and eventually my dissertation committee for the English department. He continued to support me after my graduation in 2021 on the job market as well, and as I settled into my current position as assistant professor of English at University of the Ozarks, which is a small liberal arts college in Arkansas, where I teach and research on 20th century global Anglophone literatures of Africa, the Caribbean, and transatlantic modernism. So in his invitation, Glenn suggested that we might show how our own work since the seminar, quote, bears the influence of Byron's presence and of the course. So here I mean somewhat to shirk the duty that Glenn has asked of us, or perhaps to redirect it a little bit. I don't really want to speak about my own work today. That is, I don't really want to describe to you something that might look like a body of work, the articles and manuscripts and courses and syllabi that could and should be linked back to the spring of 2017 and to my many conversations with Byron, and establish those links. Those links live in and as that work, and they are endlessly discoverable in it. What I want to do instead is to examine how what I might call that work that I pretend to be my own lives through this influence, and how this influence lives, how it bears, and how it's born. So I can begin by saying simply that this is an influence that my work cannot bear, and that I might presume to say no work can. Having borne the marks of this influence as my work itself, how can I think of them as something to be born, to be carried, or to be displayed? How can I show that what bears forth my work possesses anything of a link that can be distinguished and articulated? This work that I presume to call my own, but that is never mine, that can never be said to be something I control, that I own, that is mine alone, how can it bear such a scrutiny? So it's rather the marking of the influence itself that I want to focus on here today. So what does it mean to bear an influence and to lay bare that influence here today as the honoring of a life that gave such life to the very capacity for a thought and a work, the very thought that cobbled together in the flush of a few short years under Byron's guidance, surely not his alone, though it would be difficult to disentangle that influence from the influence that was brought to bear upon what I was only then beginning to think could go by the name of my work as a doctoral student at Kansas. The very thought that began to resemble anything that one day one could call a work, the having of a work, which that influence more than stimulated or shaped or guided or encouraged to, more than directed, more than simply imparted. An influence, this influence again, cannot be borne. It is unbearable. There is no hope. Am I doing justice to the weight of this gift? And if I'm bearing Byron's influence, it is both as a kind of badge, as a sign I might give in my work to the thought that even rendered it possible, and is so much more than what can be held and weighed, and none of this is anything to be set aside. So it's been almost 8 years in my case. In the spring, it will have been 8 years since we all sat together in that seminar and began or continue to return to the question of a decolonization for knowledge, to the knowledge of that which is not yet but would become an influence. And it could hardly be missed that the question of this course was and is itself one of an influence, of the influence and influencing of knowledge as influence and knowledge as influence upon each of the course's aspects: discourse, culture, identity, science, development, nature would have been a few of these. Of how knowledge is colonized and colonizes, and how to unmake the propagation of this influence, and in doing so to facilitate or allow for the cultivation of an influence to knowledge, the vitality of which would be to reveal the violence of an influence submerged in knowledge production of all kinds, such that a constellation of influences otherwise can arise as the knowledges they are and might be. So for those of us who were students in the seminar in 2017, the first such influence offered us from the body of this influence to knowledge itself, the first suggestion of this coming influence and the shape of an influence at hand was set out in the epigraph to the course's syllabus, which comes from the closing passage of Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. These lines are now, though it's easy to forget that they were not then for many of us, so very familiar. This is slightly modified. Quote, "So comrades, let us not pay tribute to Europe by creating states, institutions, and societies which draw their inspiration from her. For Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity, comrades, we must turn over a new leaf. We must work out new concepts and try to set afoot a new man. So here it was and is. The first influence was to be that of the very question and questioning of an influence and how that might be influenced. First, to note and in so doing put paid to an influence, the influence of Europe upon Africa and all of those lands that had been claimed as its colonies. And then this false inspiration set aside to pursue what would be the influencing of self and other of Europe and humanity upon the paths of a coexistence that would lead each of these through knowledges not established by their imperial past, but opened by their reimagined collective futures, which is not to say, of course, forgetting those paths. And so a double influence was set before us within the nascent influence of this seminar, the shades of which were gradually set afoot, laid at our feet. Slowly enveloped in the textures of these influences as we would come to be, their emergence across the epistemic registers examined in the seminar would trace the contours of, to oversimplify considerably, though in a manner somewhat of the order of a syllabus, the influences of Eurocentrism, racialized hierarchy, sexual othering, and the disparate colonialities by which knowledge is guided toward westernized capitalistic logics of progress and development as if by invisible hand, and then how these might be subverted. Crucial to this, and here I become capable of saying something more specifically about Byron's influence, are the shades of its ecology. And so when, in the seminar's 9th week, we read selections from Byron's 2014 book, Different Shades of Green, it is in the first paragraph of these selections, on the opening page of the book's first chapter, that we again find ourselves before the question of an influence of, to, and for knowledge, an influence that is and has been a matter of and for colonization and decolonization. In this opening paragraph, which begins with Byron describing the critique of African environmental writing from the perspective of a Western, quote, mainstream environmental discourse, he notes that, quote, such discourse often implies that the closer one gets to the truths of ecology and to appreciation and care for nature, the more one escapes the influence of socioeconomic interests and becomes a true environmentalist with nature as constituency. And so here again, it will be an influence that must be subverted, that must become visible to knowledge so that another knowledge can come out of its shadow, as we sit here in the shadows ourselves. Yet this time it is to be the very breaking of an influence that must be repaired, the falsity of a disavowed influence of the socioeconomic upon the ecological that must be knitted back together in order that environmentalism can live in the practices and knowledges and material context of those who have been colonized, rather than held aside behind the facades of an exterior management which has allotted to itself through the extracted wealth of its fiscal and epistemological force sole rights of authenticity for the preservation of Africa, or rather we might say of an Africa. There are, as Byron affirms in his book's title, without saying outright within its pages, different shades to this epistemology of environmentalism, which as the book progresses will become as well an activist in literary history and a work of environmental justice in its own right. There are different shades to these works in history, shades of shades, and like the new leaf that Fanon asks us to find and turn over, each of these different shades will be a shade of green. 2, like the shades of Byron's thought itself, like those of his teaching, each provides the shade of a green. Each one held to the light casts a shadow that marks, trembling, the shape of a space for verdancy, for thought, for living. In the cool lattice work of these shades, dancing across the grass, one can mark the elusive contours of those epistemic forms of a coloniality to be undone, and they will encounter also the fugitive ways of knowing from out of which emerges the decolonization of knowledge. I often tell my own students that the single most important thing I learned during my time in graduate school was how to think ambivalently, how not to ever reduce a force, an idea, a concept, a knowledge to a monolith, or what amounts to the same thing, a duality. How to allow every history to breathe, to sway as it comes into relief, to let oneself trace where an idea has been and can go without reduction, without categorization into a preconceived taxonomy. This is a skill I learned from Byron. In the seminar, in our one-on-one discussions, in his role as mentor and teacher, Byron steadily, persistently asked us to think this way, to see if we could define concepts on our own terms, to discover if we could analyze texts and ideas without resolving them into notions inherited from others. I don't know if I've ever succeeded in this, but it might be said that whatever can be said to be my work is the work of my trying. It remains to us scholars, writers, critics, teachers, to try every day to create a world in which everything remains in question, a world that's increasingly difficult to realize, in no small part because of the loss of Byron. In the closing lines of Different Shades of Green, he described his project as a, quote, model of reading that holds in abeyance forms of closure as it draws on intertextual dialogue as a means to bring to consciousness the socio-ecological unconscious of narratives offered by political ecology or developed in the context of environmental justice struggles. No closure, only the continuance of a work in the shades. And though his rigor as a thinker of ambivalence never wavered, Byron was never ambivalent as a teacher and a mentor. He was always absolutely supportive, always confident in the abilities and eventual successes of his students. I still have the last email I received from him a couple of years ago. When though well removed from my graduation at KU, I sought his help and advice. In his reply, he enthusiastically encouraged me, and despite being already in what he described as a strong regime of chemo, happily agreed to do whatever he could. In the final line of his reply, speaking of my future academic prospects, Byron wrote that, quote, it will happen. The question is just when. What is this work that still remains to happen? Suffice it to say, in closing, that in every word I've said here today is a work made possible by the shade cast by that influence. That it is only in the stillness of that shade that anything that might constitute a work can take place. Influence, as they used to say, is in the stars, in the firmament, in the air, in the ushering of a breeze, in the sway. Here, in the fluttering of green shades, one can breathe and anything can be born. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. And our next speaker, on the program at least, is Ogochukwu Ngudike, but she's not presently here. I don't know, Ogo, I don't think is online either. So we will go to, hopefully she will come soon. And in the meantime, we'll go to the next speaker, who is Ayawa Kad. Do you want to be here?
Please help me with this. Good afternoon, everyone. So many thanks to Glenn Adams for inviting me and my colleagues to speak about this great scholar, Byron Santangelo. He was in my dissertation committee and my comms exam. And his work really informed my research in many ways. I can't tell I can do him justice. I'm really grateful to him for all the advice, for all the works that he suggested. My passion was reignited. I would say my passion in prison literature was reignited by him and by the seminar that he and Glenn Adams co-taught at KU. I wrote my master's thesis on political imprisonment, but then I was like struggling with how I'm going to contribute something new if I'm going, to pursue this passion and write my PhD dissertation on Arabic prison literature. But this seminar, Decolonizing Knowledge, really introduced me to decolonial studies and theories, and helped me find my voice and see where I can and what I can contribute to the existing scholarship. This is on one hand. On the other hand, Byron Santangelo's last work, titled, it's a chapter that he published in the Cambridge Companion to Literature and the Anthropocene. That chapter is titled The Essay. In this chapter, he talked about creative nonfiction, which is like this old new genre in which, you know, different genres overlap. And I was struggling, you know, while reading different Arabic prison narratives, I was struggling to categorize my work, like these narratives, like where can I place them neatly? But he did that masterfully. He, in the essay, which is a creative nonfiction, he analyzed and critiqued Amitav Ghosh work about climate change, and, you know, analyzing this from a post-colonial, decolonial perspective. And he did talk about the strength and the limitations of this genre. And then I started to think of prison creative nonfiction as a parallel genre to climate nonfiction. So I would say Byron Santangelo's work and seminar really informed me in major ways. I'm not good at expressing my feelings and my gratitude, so I'm going to read part of my work, and which I hope that shows how I integrated decolonial theories and to my reading of Arabic prison literature and the significant role it plays. Briefly, Arabic prison literature has been has been investigated from several perspectives, from socio-political, activist, psychological, feminist, and aesthetic perspective, and post-colonial perspective. However, less has been said about how this literature explored the ongoing colonialism in prisons, the working of colonialism in prisons. I felt that, well, this might be my contribution, and I would love to hear more comments and maybe suggestions, because I'm working to transform this work into a manuscript. The second chapter of my dissertation, titled The Coloniality of Prison Manifestations in Arabic Prison Narratives, I say, the post-independence prison in the Arab world is a site of coloniality. It has a neo-colonial dimension when perceived in relation to history and policy, in addition to its reductionist social function as a dumping place for nonconformists. In this chapter, I examined selected Arabic prison narratives written by and about individuals who experienced imprisonment in the late 20th century in order to unpack the working of colonialism in prison. I argue that this corpus of writing goes beyond exposing regimes' abuse of power and beyond narrating or like healing the writer and the nation. I argue that this corpus of writing exposes the hidden structure of colonial violence that the layered space of Western modernity unfolds, stressing that the coloniality of prison in the Arab world operates via indirect and direct Western intervention that takes different forms. Orientalist reports about prisons, the colonial history of prisons, humanitarian aid and missionary services, and torture-related trainings. Arabic prison narratives furthermore demonstrates how coloniality resurfaces in the discourse of nationalism that crushes difference, reinforces colonial borders, challenges a decolonial regional identity that the support for the Palestinian cause of liberation would bring about, and reproduces a disconnect between the self, society, and nature. Starting with Arabic prison literature role in historicizing the prison and exposing the underexplored role of Orientalists, I said, or I've written, during the late Ottomans' reign between 1839 and 1922, Orientalist reports by European prison inspectors depicted the conditions in Ottoman prisons as very poor. According to historian Kent Scholl, in his study of prisons in the late Ottoman period, European prison inspectors hoped to reveal that the Ottomans' barbaric and uncivilized nature manifest itself in their prisons, and they wanted to demonstrate that the Ottomans are unfit for self-rule. Scholl shows how the Ottoman state responded in the face of European modernity, which carried within its layered spaces a new world order that threatened Ottoman stability and even existence. Scholl explores how, in order to face the internal crises and the external threats of European imperialism, the Ottoman system of penalty and incarceration witnessed major reform in the 19th century. As part of the reformation movement that the Ottoman Empire adopted on different levels, the Ottomans' reform movement, however, failed to counter the Western imperial project and its Orientalist reportage tactic, which facilitated colonialism in the region. Arab prison writers like the Jordanian Hashim Gharaibeh document this Orientalist interest in the region, in the prisons of the region, retrieving the historical archive and rewriting history. He and other Jordanian prison writers educate readers about the colonial history of prisons. In his prison novel, The Cat Who Taught Me How to Fly, Gharaibeh relates the history of Irbid Hill, where the prison was founded. And then he turns to Orientalist accounts that trace that history. He does that toward the end of the novel in a chapter titled Winter Returns, a metaphor suggestive of the cyclical nature of the imperial projects and the continuity of its tactics. Gharaibeh writes, traces from the Bronze Age and the Hellenistic civilization and then Greek, Roman, and Islamic Mamluks and then the Ottomans were found in Irbid's Hill. The Saraya building, which is now the prison, dates back to the reign of the Mamluk. Within its walls, they stored the ice blocks brought down from Mount Hermon, packed and shipped to Egypt. When the Ottomans came to the region, they built the Saraya, which is the soldiers' residence, during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, according to plans made by Sinan Pasha, and it became the symbol of their authority in the area. This was confirmed by Swiss traveler Johann Berkelett, who passed by Irbid in 1812, end of quote. Gharaibeh here refers to the Orientalist Johann Berkelett, who visited the place, the Saraya in Irbid, northern Jordan, and reported how it changed from a site of commerce and economic power during the Mamluk period to a military post in early 19th century under the Ottoman reign. Berkelett travels to the Levant, Arabia, and North Africa, were sponsored by the Association for Promoting the Discovery of the Interior Parts of Africa, or later known as the African Association, as documented in the preface to his later accounts. His memoir, Travels in Syria and the Holy Land, was edited by William Martin Leake, who was the acting secretary of the African Association at that time. Although the association stressed in its proceedings and preface to its publication that its sole profit object is the promotion of discoveries in the African continent, its work have paved the way to colonialism in the region. Gharaibeh continues his narration of the history of Irbid prison, showing how, I'm quoting here, when the Ottomans spread their control over Irbid and the surrounding areas again, they repaired the building and made it in 1866 a prison and a center for the gendarmerie. Gharaibeh also mentions the German-American Orientalist Gottlieb Schumacher, who paid frequent visits to Irbid at the end of the 19th century. In 1884, Schumacher reported an abandoned building he observed, which shelters shepherds, bandits, and farmers during the winter. This abandonment of the place suggests the diminishing authority of the Ottoman state at that time and the increasing intervention of the Western colonial power. The frequent Orientalist visit to the place indicate the increasing colonial interest in the region. It's worth noting first that these Orientalist surveys of the Levant with maps and illustrations, as mentioned in the preface to Schumacher's travels accounts, Pella and Abella of Decapolis, and these are two cities in Jordan, in the northern part of Jordan, were funded by, so his travels and research was funded by, funded and by and executed and written for the Committee of the Palestine Exploration Fund, an imperial foundation established in 1865 in London and patronized by Queen Victoria to recruit academics and scholars to study historical Palestine and the Levant region on different levels, archaeological, historical, anthropological, cultural, etc. Second, according to the Palestinian Exploration Fund website, when the leaders of the group, meaning the Temple Association, began to carry out their plan to colonize Palestine in the late 1860s, the Schumacher family settled in Haifa in Palestine, where Jacob Gottlieb Schumacher's father, who was a Templar, designed most of the German colony in Palestine in Haifa, as well as many buildings for the various Christian communities of Galilee. Gharaib's reliance on these Orientalist reports to historicize the place is deliberate. He is exposing the underexplored role of the travel reports of Orientalists who have studied the region and gathered intelligence information that has facilitated its colonialism. Another significant role of prison literature is how it challenges a decolonial, It help forms a decolonial regional identity that Arab regimes, fear. The Palestinian question, along with the issue of refugees and the right to return, which is a regional Arabic concern, has become, after 1967 defeat, one of the main reasons for hundreds of thousands being arrested, tortured, or executed. Coloniality reappears in the discourse of Arab nationalism, which fears the decolonial regional identity that supporting the Palestinian question would form and assert. Arab governments that once worked for the dream of pan-Arab unity during their anti-colonial struggle for liberation and independence failed to find a common ground to bridge the gap between themselves and opposition groups that call against normalizing relation with the Israeli occupation. Cultural critic Hamid Dabashi of Columbia University attributes the failure of ideological resistance to colonialism to self-orientalism, explaining, the colonized couldn't but speak the language of the colonizer and thus negationally implicate the validity of colonial modernity, imitate its parameters, whether they celebrated or opposed it. Several Arab governments appropriated colonial violence in their confrontation with those who opposed them. They met protesting or protest against the Israeli occupation and normalizing relations with arbitrary arrest, detention, and execution. And that was something that Gharaib highlights in his novel back in the 70s. And we see history repeating itself now with Arab governments arresting protesters because they call for ceasefire and the end of the Israeli occupation of northern Gaza. Because of this violent response to protests during the 1978 Palestinian uprising, Arab writers from Morocco, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and elsewhere met in Yemen to discuss their own revised relationship of alternating compromise and active support for the Palestinian struggle. Just to mention an example from from Gharaib's novel, The Cat. Gharaib himself was imprisoned in 1977 during Jordan's martial law era, which spanned from 67 to 89. He depicts the tight-fisted attitude the Jordanian government took towards opposition, denouncing the Israeli occupation through relating the story of his leftist protagonist, Imad. Security forces arrest Imad for a protest he leads on Yarmouk University campus in Irbid in solidarity with Al Jalil uprising in 1976 in response to the Israeli government confiscation of thousands of hectares of lands from the Palestinians. And we see this now repeating itself in northern Gaza. Gharaib depicts how during these times of turmoil, the government, through its mainstream radio and TV station, propagates homogeneity and stability of the country. Nationalist ideas filter into the media, cultivating consent and showing the country as an oasis of security, stability, and as one family. Academic institutions become part of what Foucault accurately calls the carceral society. Flyers and posters are censored and forbidden, and they quickly disappear. I'm gonna finish by emphasizing the role of prison literature as an act of decoloniality. Arabic prison writers are manuals of resistance that counter the colonial manuals of torture. Their oral testimonies, written stories, and creative art pieces in prison and after release is an act of decoloniality that aims toward disrupting the internalized inferiority that obstruct psychological liberation, as well as building a culture of consciousness that is first and foremost critical of collective ignorance and amnesia about coloniality that safeguards the power dynamic inside and outside the prison. Byron Santangelo really stresses the importance of consulting non-Western philosophies, and this opened my eyes to works like Malik bin Nabi, the Algerian Malik bin Nabi, who's since the 70s, he was talking about decolonialism, but he didn't use the word decolonization or coloniality. But it's interesting to put these scholars like Mignolo and Arab Muslim scholars like Bin Nabi and Muhammad al-Ghazali in conversation with each other when it comes to decoloniality and the coloniality of knowledge. I'll stop here. I feel maybe it might be a fragmented kind of a presentation, but maybe it's the fragmented nature of my brain and the fragmented or the chaos in the outside world and writing and presenting during a genocide. So thank you so much, and may Byron Santangelo's soul rest in peace.
Okay, so Ogo is still not here. So we'll move to the next presenter, Nader Hakim, who is now at North Central College in Illinois, is going to speak about confronting the coloniality and social psychological knowledge regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So a follow-up from the previous conversation. You should be able, I think.
Let's try. Yep, worked.
Yes.
Great.
I think you're now in presenter. We can see the presenter view, so you probably want us to see the presentation itself.
Try something else. Still, same thing, yeah?
If you hit
Yeah,
swap at the top, swap displays at the top, it should be
Is
the
that
top
it?
left.
Oh, thanks, Trevor.
Yep.
Nice, thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Glenn, and I'm really, it's really cool to be a part of this panel. And like Glenn mentioned, this will be a natural continuation from Aya's presentation. And it was good to hear from Aya. Me and Aya were in the seminar together. I don't know if that must have been 2016 or 17 or even 18. I'm really actually not sure. But I want to say before I start that in addition to being very sad with the passing of Byron Santangelo, I'm also have quite a lot of sadness thinking about how hard it will be to replicate the intellectual space that he and Glenn co-created. And I should have better words, but it was basically just the stereotypical vision of a graduate seminar, of the ideas being central, of the interdisciplinarity. And again, it makes me sad. I don't know if I'll ever have a space like that again. And this feels like a perfect commemoration because of the space that they created, and they're putting me in conversation with colleagues in English and literature and Francophone studies. And I consider myself very fortunate because I'm in a very sterile science building now. And, you know, my physics colleagues and engineering colleagues are wonderful in their own right, but I miss these other colleagues. And every week we had those 2.5 hours that I would walk into quite excited, also a little bit nervous, but I grew so much from having that intellectual community. And it's a testament to Byron that he was able to traverse all those disciplines and reach me and influence me as a very traditional social psychologist. And that, you know, I would dream to have that kind of intellectual contribution to the field, of being able to touch people in other disciplines and influence their work. And so in that regard, I want to talk a little bit about a project that emerged from that seminar, of which Glenn is a collaborator, along with some others that I'll acknowledge at the end. And I want to acknowledge too that it's difficult to engage with a speaker who's remote, and I really wish that I could be there. And I'm going to be cutting through some things. But if you're interested in learning more about this project, it has been since been published, and I would invite you to read it and to follow up with me or my collaborators. So as the title says, the idea of this project emerged from my reading of a particular content area or particular context that's studied in social psychology. For researchers who want to study conflict, there's no more classic, more perfect fertile testing ground than the Israeli-Palestinian context for seeing how our social psychological ideas about what creates and perpetuates and correlates with conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so I've always been drawn to intergroup relations research, and this particular context has always been important to me. And it drew me for those converging reasons. I was always drawn to the papers that studied this context, and I always read those papers and had a very bad taste in my mouth after reading them. And I could identify why in some cases, but I thought that with what I was learning in this course, I could apply an intellectual theoretical critique to identify and systematize and name that bad taste in my mouth. So the way I think about the coloniality of knowledge is a way of thinking about how there's important inextricable links between knowledge production and history, that the knowledge that we produce is not somehow abstracted from or removed from history, but is, again, inextricably linked. And to fast forward very, very quickly, to think about one way that occurs, especially in psychology, where researchers want to understand the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of people mired in intergroup conflict. One common manifestation of that coloniality of knowledge, of thinking that there's some separation from between knowledge and history, is to separate people from their context, or we can call abstraction from context, which facilitates two illusions that we use to think through our meta-theoretical review. The first illusion is that there's such a possibility that researchers can study the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a neutral way, or to say that, and I'm sorry, these should be two separate bullet points. The first one is researchers can study the Israeli-Palestinian conflict neutrally. In other words, that there is such a possibility as not being on the train that's moving in history. And this occurred, this research in our paper occurred before the ongoing genocide. And even before the ongoing genocide, to think through that many of the researchers involved with this research were intentionally trying to think about it in we're going to take both sides here. We're going to think through both sides. And I'll talk about how that manifested later on. And related to that, the other illusion was that both sides approach, or that abstraction, would inherently be more rational. Anything that was politicized, anything that took a side, that would be biased. What's not biased is to pretend that we're on the outside. That's the illusion that researchers tell themselves. And so a distant analysis was always perceived as inherently more rational. And one thing this comes up is through what the social psychological literature calls intractable conflict. So this abstraction would occur through conceptualizing Israel-Palestine as an intractable conflict, which is defined as being irresolvable, as composed of zero-sum claims, of requiring compromise. And notice how the intractable conflict psychologizes the situation and ignores the claims of the indigenous Palestinian population and affirms assumptions about people who have competing narratives, where history starts now and compromises have to be made from both sides. And again, all this is for the purposes of not making political claims in our research, because again, to do so would be biased in a way that being abstracted is not biased. So this served as the foundation for some research questions, two of which I will go through. One of which, the first question is, how do researchers study the Palestinian conflict? So who are the researchers, who's participating, how do they frame it? And what do they construe as the desirable outcomes? So to fast forward quickly, so again, what I want to talk through is a project in which we gathered many, many primary sources, social psychological papers examining this context. We ended up with 149 experiments reported in 92 papers published in 29 different journals. So I'm going to go straight to the second question of how researchers frame the context. And here the idea was, how often do researchers contextualize it within the material reality? For example, through the internationally agreed upon occupation of Palestine. The idea here is that in psychology, before the method and before the results are reported about some empirical analysis, the researchers have to give their readers some kind of context in the introduction section. And the idea here was, if I was writing this paper, if any observer was writing this paper and trying to contextualize it, again, within the material reality, it would probably make sense to use the word occupation, or to use the word settlements, or to maybe use the word apartheid or settler colonialism. Not surprisingly, that word appeared very, very infrequently. So of the 92 articles, only 18 used the word occupation. So this is a very blunt, but also conservative test of researchers' contextualizations. Occupation, occupy, very rarely occurred, as did settlements rarely occur. The word terrorism also did not occur very frequently, but it's interesting to note that it occurred as frequently as the material realities like occupation or settlements. And interestingly, and not surprisingly, all the examples of terrorism were used to describe the actions of Palestinians, never to describe the actions of the Zionists. And most importantly, in contrast, the most common way that researchers contextualize Israel-Palestine is not through these materially relevant descriptions, but through this psychologization, through intractable conflict. In other words, for these authors of these papers, what matters in their minds for readers to know and to appreciate is that this is an intractable conflict. Not that this is an occupation, not that this is apartheid or something else materially relevant. I would say one of the most valuable outcomes from the seminar was in my thinking through this particular section of the argument, which was to think about how violence is framed. And oftentimes researchers in their both sidesist approach would frame violence as occurring in a tit-for-tat way, always of the spectacular kind, the literal explosive kind, and not the slow violence. So for example, these are some quotes from the articles that we're reviewing. In response to rocket fire from the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip, 1,398 Palestinians were killed by Israeli strikes, and over 1 million Israelis lived within range of Hamas rockets, routinely running to bomb shelters as air raid sirens rang overhead. I'm embarrassed to even try to do some narrative analysis in front of my colleagues in the humanities who are trained in this in a way that I'm not. But I think at a surface level, there's so much going on here that's worth noting, right? So we have the actual violence of Palestinians being killed, and then the potential violence being put side by side, as if the potential for these Hamas rockets and the millions of Israelis that have to flee is equivalent to the 1,400 Palestinians that were killed. And to know also the depth with which the authors illustrate the situation of the Israelis fleeing, right, who are running to bomb shelters as air raid sirens ring overhead. Nowhere else in this article did the authors devote space and attention to any narrative description of what the Palestinians were experiencing. Another quote, Palestinians feel victimized by the Israeli occupation, yet are condemned worldwide for terrorist attacks, which they consider a legitimate form of resistance, or when Israelis are rocketed yet condemned for bombing Gaza, which they consider a legitimate form of self-defense. So again, this equation of this conundrum, there's one conundrum for the Palestinians who have these options and are perceived this way, and there's a conundrum for the Israelis who have these options and are perceived this way. No question of not just the power asymmetry, but the realization of that power asymmetry through occupation and the violence against Palestinians. Or quote, where the state of Israel is perceived as the powerful sovereign and the Palestinians are the so-called weaker party. It seems like this author needed to call into question that one of the parties is more powerful than the other. Next, we move to thinking about the desirable outcomes. And here it's worth just mentioning that our assumption is that when researchers conduct studies and they measure the outcomes of their experiments, they want to see how does this intervention that we test in the study affect this thing. And the idea would be those outcomes are probably representative of what researchers perceive as desirable. So I'm gonna go through this quickly, but I just want to connect in connection with something that Aya mentioned about the right of return. To bring up UN Resolution 194, which states that refugees wishing to return to their homes should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable dates. And it's worth noting that only 1 out of 149 studies measured support for a policy consistent with UN Resolution 194. So think about what is the internationally agreed upon right for Palestinians who were expelled or fled their homes since 1948, and what is in the realm of possibility for these researchers. What I perceive this as is that for the researcher studying this, it could be one of two things: that they don't care about this right, or they don't perceive it as an option for their participants to actually agree or disagree with. Instead, they would measure some aspect of compromise on the right of return, like monetary compensation to allow a limited number of refugees to return, or symbolic compromise. All of these are direct quotes from studies that frame themselves as measuring reconciliation. All of these would probably, the titles of the articles from which these items are drawn would probably mention something like reconciliation or compromise, and they would present themselves as contributing to our understanding and the knowledge production for figuring out what gets us closer to compromise or resolution. And notice how all of them do not live up to the basic human right for people who flee or expelled from their homes to go back. They're all symbolic compromises. In addition, 0 studies measured support for a binational or one state solution with equal rights for Palestinians and Jewish Israelis. They all reproduced the liberal Zionist outcome of a 2-state solution, which, as we know, the state of Israel itself has never authentically pursued, but is parroted by the U.S. and its proxies as peace. So in summary, the vast majority of researchers are based at Israeli, North American, European institutions. They contextualize Palestine as intractable rather than occupation or apartheid, and they measure how people feel rather than policy. And even when they do measure policy, they don't live up to to actually fulfilling the rights of Palestinians, and they don't challenge the liberal Zionist status quo. And I'll end by kind of bringing back the theory that I benefited so much from in the seminar those 6-7 years ago, was to think about again, and this feels extremely pressing now given what we're seeing happening in Palestine, of the way that knowledge production is entwined with colonial violence. So the idea here is that the researchers behind these papers, I'm confident, feel like they're contributing to knowledge production about peace and reconciliation. But it's interesting to know how, again, they never challenged the current colonial status quo, and they're fully consistent with the dictates of what the United States and the state of Israel are conducting. I want to acknowledge my collaborators in this project, and just as a wrap up with what I was talking about, just as a wrap up in terms of a thank you to Byron and to Glenn, I would say that Byron was instrumental in my intellectual maturity. I think I came into that seminar quite intellectually immature, and I had more political ideas, honestly. And I really wish that I could sit in a room with him and all the peers across campus, and think through what this kind of project, what its role is, and what the best way to present it to my peers, to the public, how to think about it myself, because I'm struggling a lot with how to take this project and make sense of it, given the colonial violence that we're seeing unfolding in front of our eyes these days. And I think Byron and my peers and Glenn would have been really instrumental, and I'm so grateful for that.
I had us muted in the room, but people were clapping. Thank you very much, Nader, for the presentation. And we still don't have Ogo with us, and so we'll proceed to Trevor Lease, who is a student at the University of Kansas currently, and he will talk about denaturalizing the natural.
All right, can you see the screen appropriately?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. All right, hi everyone. Thanks Glenn for the introduction. My name's Trevor Lease. I'm a PhD candidate in social psychology at the University of Kansas, and it's a privilege to be speaking here with you all. And unless Ogo shows up to give their presentation, it's also a privilege to round out this very important symposium in honor of Dr. Byron Santangelo. Yeah, to start us off, I will take everyone back to a time period that's very similar to when the other speakers first met Byron, when I was an undergrad in the fall of 2017, taking Byron's course that was cross-listed in history and environmental studies called Ethics, Ideas, and Nature. And what you see on the screen here are my notes from the first day of Byron's class, where he set the stage for the semester by laying out the core concepts of the course. Little did I know then that these discussions would also be crucial to my doctoral work that would begin just 2 years later. Byron directed us to questions that I feel many people take for granted, which the other speakers have also alluded to, such as, what is nature? What is the environment? Is nature just green things we see outside of our windows? Is it a manicured park? Is it a remote region far from cities? We also considered what are ethics, and accordingly, what are environmental ethics, given the focus of the course, which he defined as rules or ways of thinking that govern human interaction with the rest of the world. Several crucial questions that follow from this conceptual foundation are to ask, what are the political implications of calling certain areas natural and others unnatural, or treating certain ideas as common sense? And what are the political implications of calling some environmental ethics or certain tendencies and values natural and others as unnatural? One of the central takeaways I took from this undergraduate course with Byron is that environmental ethics, these culturally inscribed rules we follow when we think about and engage with the rest of nature and the environment, tend to reflect and promote particular community-specific sensibilities. And one place these environmental ethics manifest is through what many people call environmentalism, or the various social programs that different communities conceive in response to ecological degradation with a mission to alleviate such degradation. And of course, there have been various different forms of environmentalism throughout history, such as the numerous prominent and growing movements for environmental justice in the global South and among marginalized communities in the global North. But one lesson that Byron stressed is that forms of environmentalism that come from affluent communities because of historical power structures and the distribution of power throughout society, those from affluent communities tend to dominate public consciousness. And one of these threads of environmentalism that Byron introduced me to is called the cult of wilderness, which historian Joan Martinez Alier describes as one of the earliest programs of environmentalism, stemming primarily from efforts for upper-class nature preservation in post-colonial settings. In brief, through the cult of wilderness, colonial authorities aimed to advance the preservation of so-called pristine nature for aesthetic and ecological purposes and not for any human livelihood purpose. In many African settings and in places such as historic Palestine, just briefly showing this excellent article in case people aren't aware of it, because I'm a huge fan. This meant transforming indigenous lands during and after forcibly removing the indigenous inhabitants from their historic homelands into places that colonial authorities would then refer to as natural or pristine. And accordingly, one lesson we can take from examining environmental ethics that characterize the cult of wilderness is that these natural spaces are anything but natural. They're intensely cultural products, culturally produced, and they bear history, they bear power. They also can reflect and promote ignorance of historical violence, particularly with the cult of wilderness with its emphasis on pristine nature. And one reading we considered in this undergraduate class with Byron demonstrated this point very well. It comes from Evelyn White, who is a writer who wrote about how Black women such as herself tend to experience nature and the wilderness. Evelyn White wrote, "My genetic memory of ancestors hunted down and preyed upon in rural settings counters my fervent hopes of finding peace in the wilderness. Instead of the solace and comfort I seek, I imagine myself in the country as my forebears were, exposed, vulnerable, and unprotected, a target of cruelty and hate." So White very obviously demonstrating the cultural differences as a function of power, racialized power, and inequity that shape how people conceive of and construct these settings. I also, like my fellow presenters, had the opportunity to take the graduate seminar on decolonizing knowledge taught by Byron and my advisor, Glenn Adams. The three of us pictured here online during COVID class in the fall or spring of 2020. I don't know that either of them know I took this picture, but one of the central lessons from this course, which the other presenters have stressed, is that mainstream academic knowledges are inseparable from structures of colonialism, both as a historical project and as an enduring force on contemporary social life. In this course, we learned how hegemonic forms of knowledge and associated cultural sensibilities tend to sustain and reinforce the status quo, while historically subordinated forms are more equipped to challenge and reconfigure it. With specific respect to my area of focus on environmentalism, this also meant directing attention to how colonialism and capitalism have prompted the ecological crisis that we currently face. So not only is the crisis itself a product of colonial history, but so are the forms of addressing it. So the racialized variation that Evelyn White noted, that I showed on the previous slide, are products, that racialized variation is a product of colonial and imperialist exploitation. And what's critical to consider here is that dominant forms of environmentalism, and indeed environmentalism in general, can both exist as a genuine response to the ecological crisis, because they're forms of action that arise in response to degradation because it is occurring, and they can also be methods of preserving the status quo, which many people would call coloniality, as it manifests through these forms of engagement. In other words, the cult of wilderness, linking back with that thread in particular, might be just as much about preserving nature as it is about preserving existing political and economic structures. So to bring this a little closer to my area of expertise, we can consider the discipline of environmental psychology, which is arguably one of Western or white or hegemonic psychology's primary contributions to engaging the ecological crisis. Crucially, one finding of recent critical scholarship in this area is that mainstream work, similar to the work that Nader described, tends to evade the relevance of power, culture, and history to its topics of focus, particularly the ecological crisis, to the layouts of everyday physical space, and more specifically, for our purposes today, to the study of environmentalism. Instead, dominant foci of the field, which tend to pursue individualistic and individualizing explanations for psychological phenomena and behavioral phenomena, tend to explore how to prompt personal behavior change, how to shift a person's attitudes, and how to get people back to nature as a method to cultivate some sort of environmental consciousness to equip them to better engage the ecological crisis. Indeed, many researchers in the field emphasize how state and national parks, one real-world contemporary outgrowth of the cult of wilderness, can cultivate engagement with climate change. Several scholars in the field describe these parks in particular, as a primary site for climate change communication and education. So given my training in these critical perspectives, I've described going through the Decolonizing Knowledge course and after. One broad research question I've asked basically concerns whether this claim holds up. Do dominant environmentalist institutions that are grounded in these colonial concepts of nature, such as the cult of wilderness, actually promote engagement with the ecological crisis? And I considered this question actually in between the undergraduate course and the graduate course, but this wasn't published until after the graduate course with Glenn and Byron. I considered this question in the aftermath of historic severe flooding across the Midwest United States in 2019. I interviewed 41 visitors to a state park in Kansas because I was curious whether they thought the recent historic flooding was related in any way to climate change, and also in how they tended to navigate conversations about this relationship in a purportedly environmentalist space. And what we found is that a majority of park visitors did not think there was a link between extreme weather and climate change. In fact, most of them tended to deny a link. But it was a very important finding is that there was racialized variation in the tendency to draw a link between extreme weather and climate change, such that a substantially higher proportion of white participants who I interviewed tended to deny that there was a link between extreme weather and climate change. Another feature of this project in particular is that we situate this racialized denial amidst a conversation about local colonial history in this region of Kansas, with the help of place-based archival research I conducted in local museums and libraries, through talking about how the first European inhabitants of the region, the first colonists, the first settlers, also tended to deny the negative consequences of their settlement, which were then seen 20 years later with things like the Dust Bowl. And unfortunately, I haven't devoted as much time to get into the details of this work beyond this cursory review. But one thing that stood out in this work is that the tendency to evade attention to climate change might happen because of an institutional and cultural emphasis in parks as sites for the experience of recreation, which very much resonates with their initial intended purpose as places for settlers to escape society and get back to nature. So to further explore these ideas under the guidance of Byron and Glenn, I conducted 51 interviews with state park employees across the US and asked them very similar questions to what I asked the visitors. And there were two reasons for interviewing park employees. One was that they might be more environmentally engaged and engaged with the issue of climate change than visitors were. Second, their views on issues such as climate change and other environmental problems are both shaped by and shape the context in which they operate. On one hand, they might avoid talking about climate change to avoid speaking on issues that visitors aren't interested in or might even retaliate against. And on the other hand, to the extent that employees do engage discussions of climate change, they can suggest to visitors what topics are appropriate for discussion in these spaces and reproduce, culturally informed attention to these issues. To our surprise, we actually found that employees were less likely to attribute extreme weather to climate change than visitors were, compared to the other project, and there were several reasons that affected this process. First, we conducted statistical tests and found that park employees were more likely to draw a connection between extreme weather and climate change in settings that had more state-level political investment in climate change mitigation. So coming from the top down, if their context was more engaged, so were they in just talking to me over the phone. We also found that employees were more likely to link extreme weather to climate change if they were in a setting with fewer white conservatives. So they're very much adapting their responses to the context in which they're situated. And there's a good amount of research showing that attention to climate change very much varies along these racialized political lines in the US in particular. Another form of adaptation on which that park employees reflected was the broader cultural notions that guide the purpose of parks, why they exist in the first place, which I mentioned with the previous paper as well. As spaces that are designed to facilitate the experience of recreation and escape the burden of everyday life, owing to this historical connection with the cult of wilderness, people in general do not seem to come to parks hoping to speak or learn about climate change. In fact, the spaces are designed in many ways to facilitate an ignorance and an evasion of these issues, owing to this colonial history. So to tie everything together, one finding of this work to which Byron's influence was crucial, and these papers would not exist in their current form without his intellectual contributions, which, as Chris and others stated earlier, are immeasurable, is that the cultural institutional anchoring of parks and colonial ideas of nature inhibits their engagement with climate change and diverts attention away from the roots of climate change itself. Looking back to some of the core issues that Byron emphasized, these spaces are anything but natural. Despite their environmentalist roots and contemporary associations, they can actually divert attention from the crisis itself and exist as a form of system maintenance for a privileged few. To link this up with the title of this slide in the presentation, there's a dire need for future work in environmental psychology to continue to interrogate how dominant forms tend to advance the concerns of affluent groups and disadvantaged subordinated ones. And there are two quotes I feel serve as an appropriate conclusion to this presentation. There's a line towards the end of the first paper of ours that I showed that Byron wrote in a draft, which is that there is no concept of environmental action or concern divorced from politics. He wrote this early on in our writing, and it has sat with me since. And, this implicates how psychology studies these issues, how environmental psychology engages with them. There's a need to consider how the field's concepts are products of history and are situated within historical power dynamics. The second quote, which is very much related to this, which Chris also introduced earlier, is that which is on Byron and Glenn's syllabus for the Decolonizing Knowledge course from Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. I'll read it again because of how important it is. So, comrades, let us not pay tribute to Europe by creating states, institutions, and societies which draw their inspiration from her. For Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity, comrades, we must turn over a new leaf. We must work out new concepts and try to set foot a new human. Thank you.
Okay, once again, I had us muted, but there was applause here. Thank you, Trevor. And we will go now to Garth to hear what Garth has to say in response to the presentations and any other thing that Garth wants to say.
Thank you, Glenn. And thank you for organizing this session, Glenn. And I wanted to also thank all of the former students of you and of Byron for these excellent presentations. For those of you who don't know me, I was a professor in African American Studies and Geography at KU from 1995 to 2011, and director of KASC from 2006 to 2011, and very much a part of MAAAS. I think I was president of MAAAS twice, and I was past president, which is an official role, I think 4 times, because we couldn't get anybody else. So I stayed in this role for 2 or 3 years in a row at one point. So it's really nice, even though I'm not able to be back in person, it's nice to be able to be in the MAAAS conference. I think, first of all, it's a testimony to several things about Byron to have these presentations of students, former students, on research. And the first is his masterful role as a mentor for students and for colleagues over the course of his career. And the second is that Byron based, I think, everything in his life, not just in his scholarship, around a dialogical and a relational understanding of both intellectual material and of human beings. And I really felt that and saw that in the presentations. And I think that his voice, as I saw and heard you speaking, his voice really does echo in our heads, in my head as well, especially as I'm finishing a book that's entitled Post-Colonial Urban Studies, Edouard Glissant and the Whole World of Cities. So much of what I do bears Byron's influence, and I really appreciated the play on words about it being unbearable. But I think he would love hearing everything that all of you said, especially the deeply analytical, critical research and the passionate, nitty-gritty findings of all of these studies, because that was really his life's work. And I think the intellectual, political, and personal commitments that you all expressed are things that really Byron embodied in his research and his teaching, and they come out in your words and your work. Byron came to KU in 1997. That's my recollection of things, as well as I think some factual evidence would testify. But by 1999, he was a very important figure in MAAS, and actually the link to the discussion with Ngugi wa Thiong'o was from 1999, when my younger daughter was born, and I have a very distinct image of Ngugi carrying my daughter around the reception at the closing reception of the MAAS conference. He was Ngugi was, I think, more interested in exactly the same kinds of things that I'm saying Byron was interested in. It was human relationships, and it was this dialogical experience, and hosting Ngugi, as Byron did in 1999, because I was obviously busy with a 2-week-old child, really showed me this side of him, because I was just getting to know Byron at that point. We traveled to MAAS when KU wasn't hosting it as well on numerous occasions. I think most memorably, Glenn and Byron and I together had conversations that probably were at the start of the two of them coming to teach the seminar that many of you had when MAAS was at the University of Tulsa. And we had our reception and our dinner at the Greenwood Center in the site of the massacre. Byron was my best friend, and we shared so much of our lives together from 1997 to a few weeks before he died. We knew and understood each other very well, and I think in my life, I'm 61 years old. I can say I was 60 when Byron died. There's only been a few people outside of my immediate family that ever knew me and understood me the way Byron did. And I think it's probably the same the other way around. But I want to talk about intellectual things, because I think that was the theme and the prompt for us today. And I don't want to cry, and I don't want you to all cry. He was one of the smartest minds I've ever known. He never shied away from an intellectual argument. I had to have my argument in order in any conversation with him if I wanted to go toe-to-toe with him. We edited a book together that was built from a conference at KU that we co-organized, and we co-authored the introduction to that book on post-colonial eco-criticism. We had also co-authored an earlier article in Cultural Geographies, a post-colonial deconstruction of the Safari Museum in Chanute, Kansas. I don't know if it still exists, but I urge every one of you to go and visit it and do your own version of a deconstruction of this museum. which is a place that we first saw on the Wheat State Whirlwind bus tour of Kansas for new faculty in 1998. That was my third year, but the assistant to the dean in the school, Aaron Spirigliosi in the College of Liberal Arts, called me and insisted that I needed to come to this tour on new faculty. And I went kind of kicking and screaming, and then ended up meeting Byron, along with a number of other people who have stayed my friends ever since. Writing and editing the book and the article with Byron was actually a real delight. Neither of those processes has ever been as easy for me with anyone else, nor have I ever learned as much in any of the co-authored or co-edited pieces that I've had before or since. And when I say it was easy, it doesn't mean we always agreed on everything. It meant that we had conversations from the beginning of the process to the end that were enriching. Because Byron never approached collaboration or education as empire building or as self-aggrandizement. He always had a lot to say, but he also listened. In spite of his generally loud voice and outsized persona, it's his capacity to truly listen that I miss the most. I see him even now in one of the 3 kitchens of houses he lived in Lohrentz and Bloomington, or in my kitchen in Lohrentz, or in my kitchen in Kansas, in Connecticut, listening, contemplating, pausing, thinking through something I've said, and usually kind of quietly nodding and saying, okay, yeah, I get that. And then, again, usually there was this sneaky smile that emerged and some kind of very clever joke. I think I did the same for him, and I was thinking about it, and I couldn't remember one of his in this regard. Some of them were kind of more like dad jokes, but the one that I do remember was my own. But I think it gives sort of a coda to our conversations today. And it was my insistence after when he was visiting here in Connecticut and gave a talk in my Center of Urban and Global Studies about his new book in 2014. And I insisted that he should, because it hadn't come out yet, he should change the title to 50 Shades of Green. And some of you will know that there was a series of books and then movies that were very popular at that time, which had a very different kind of perspective and theme. And I said, I mean, think of the marketing opportunity, man. I mean, of course, this is exactly the kind of thing that would set Byron off on one of those spiraling spectacular laughs that that were hard to cut off. And since I insisted to myself that I wouldn't cry today, I think the best place to end is with this memory of his laughter. And I really appreciated listening to these very intellectual talks and very important research that all of you are doing. And congratulations on the work that you've done and that you are continuing to do in his name. So thank you.
I am gonna leave it open for people. If anyone has a question they want to ask or a comment they want to make, they can please feel free to do so, online or in person. While you're considering that, I will just take the opportunity to thank all of the presenters for taking the rather vague and impossibly big instructions that I gave and trying to do something with it in a set of diverse responses to that prompt. And I want to thank everyone for giving your attention for a few moments on a busy Friday afternoon at the end of a long conference to consider this topic and this person. So if you, like me, are contemplating during that time, those of you who knew Byron, that silence is an opportunity to reconstitute his memory as we've done here, and done here from MAAS. We'll be doing a similar kind of reflection at the African Studies Association meeting in December. So if you join us, if you're in Chicago and I believe it's on the Thursday afternoon, November 12th or December 12th, sorry. You can join us for that. Thank you. To close the conference, we have some concluding remarks from the president.
All right, thank you, people. Not as the president, but as the past president. Yay. So I just want to thank you so much for being here, each and every one of you being here, being online. You've made this this worthwhile for us. And I just want to let you know that we appreciate it. Even if you came for like one session, we appreciate that very much. And as we conclude, I also just want to thank Glenn and KASC. Thank you so much for your continued support. Thank you for holding our hands. Thank you for pushing us sometimes, even when we were falling, when we were dropping the ball. And I also want to thank Kimberly and her people from KUMC Office of International Programs. Thank you so much for bearing with us and for all this and for offering to host the conference for us. We're so very, very grateful. And I want to say a special thanks to Jermaine because she has been a great resource for us.
Did you hear that?
Gath, did you hear that from Jermaine?
I didn't actually. What did she say?
I said, so they brought me back last year as quote unquote an advisor to MAAS. I just want you to know that they will bring you back from retirement. I've actually been emeritus for 7 years now. So
You can be
Yeah.
you can be the past
pass.
president.
So stay in Connecticut.
Busted.
Right, and as I hand over to the new president, I will give you a statement that in Shona, I'm from Zimbabwe, and we have a Shona saying that goes, "Pangu pe senda sakura ndezunza." What in essence it means is like, I've done my bit, now I pass on the ball. So Elizabeth, as I leave the office, Pangu pe senda sakura, now it's up to you. Maita, tatenda, siabonga. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Christabel. I don't know how to say I've received the ball and I'll take it forward in Shona, but thank you so much, and thank you everyone for choosing me to carry this on. I am really feeling privileged to have this opportunity, and I can't wait to be in touch, to do great things, to do big things, and to carry MAAS on. And so I'll see you next year. I hope I see everyone next year. And I will also be sending us off and closing the conference right now. So thank you for coming, and travel back safely to wherever you're going. Thank you. And everyone online, bye. Yeah, bye.